Year 1919. Europe was going to see the climax and the culmination of the First World War. And D.H. Lawrence leaves England for Italy. Unlike his previous travels, unlike his visits for some time, maybe weeks or maybe months, to certain places abroad, this was a decisive rejection of his homeland. Because after this, D.H. Lawrence is not frequently seen in his native land ever again. And in 1922, he leaves Europe altogether, except for short visits. And these short visits were never more than 3 years. It seems that the writer had become a traveler instead of a tourist to several different places abroad. He was not visiting. He was not going for change in climate for health reasons. He was not making private voyages for private or familial reasons, maybe romantic. He was leaving his homeland, he was leaving Europe, and 1922 onwards, he became a traveler. He became eccentric to the center of the Western world, just like T.S. Eliot was searching during modernism an alternative for European civilization or the Westland. Similarly, it seems that D.H. Lawrence was also searching for cultural and territorial alternatives, spiritual alternatives to sustain his visits to Europe were very short, therefore, after 1922, as he was outside Europe, a traveler, searching for sustainable practices from which he could derive spiritual, aesthetic, and cultural resources for continuing with the zeal of an author or creator. From 1919, if we look into the career of D.H. Lawrence as a traveler, he has remained mostly abroad. And these countries include the Mediterranean countries like France, Western countries like Germany, oceanic countries like Australia as a continent, New Mexico, and in the Far East, Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, and Tahiti, and in non-Western spaces like Malta. So it seemed that now the word traveler has become synonymous with the word author, which has become synonymous with the word discoverer. The climax of his travel as author's discovery was in 1924-25 with his final visit to Mexico and the writing of the famous book, The Plumed Serpent. Now this book, The Plumed Serpent, let us take an example of how writer as a traveler can search for cultural alternatives to his own belongings, trying to shift from his belongings to the nowhereness of a traveler and then to the somewhereness of a settler, looking for sustainable alternatives to the country and the culture he has left, and trying to find a new home in terms of cultural, aesthetic, spiritual, political sustainability. And the failures that due to certain Eurocentric bias which one cannot actually erase because these are much more than conscious, mostly unconscious. To check all this, let us take the example of D.H. Lawrence in Mexico and his book, The Plumed Serpent. The Blue Book is actually based on conflicts between groups, collectives, armed conflicts, and parallel to, and as an underbelly of, and as a bracketing factor of that armed conflict or political conflict, religious conflicts. We have the conflicts between several groups of militants trying to upset the corrupt political system of the country and trying to capture the political power for themselves, not very sure whether they would be able to do away with the corrupt system which they were going to occupy by ousting the previous rulers. And we have the religious conflicts between Christianity and paganism, the native Mexican paganism, which is mythic, which is folklorish, which is organic to the Mexican culture, but for D.H. Lawrence that is exotic because he is an outsider. And let us see how much D.H. Lawrence can gain from it and how much biased the traveler from outside remains against the ethnic indigenous culture in which he has set his feet and trying to sustain with awe and wonder. This is the typical situation of the interface between the outsider and the insider, or the traveler and the indigene. Here we have in this novel the figure of Cipriano, who is a god who brings out the fire serpent. And we have a female journalist, solo female traveler, so to say, Kate Leslie, who is Irish, so who is Western, just like, and who belongs to the UK, just like D.H. Lawrence belonged to. And Kate Leslie is accepted, molded by political, romantic, personal, environmental, and religious forces into which she was consciously as well as unconsciously delving further and further into Quetzalcoatl, which is an Aztec goddess, something like our India's Saraswati, the muse, the goddess of learning and wisdom, the goddess of beauty, and of course the female principle of the pagan religion. So we have two figures. We have the fire serpent on one hand, and we have this Saraswati-like figure of the Aztec primitive civilization. And today's Cipriano and today's Kate Leslie, they occupy symbolically in the narrative as well as literally according to the proclamations of militant groups, local people, the position of the fire serpent god and the position of the muse, learning and beauty god of that pagan culture. The story is the story of alienation from homeland and becoming a traveler, and from traveler being absorbed into the realities of the belief systems of the metaphysics of where you travel to. So Kate literally becomes from an outsider traveler to a pagan goddess of an almost lost but still sustained ancient Mexican, South American pagan religion. And this Cipriano, who is configured as the god who brings the fire serpent, the male principle, the male deity of that pagan system, is actually a contemporary guerrilla general, so to say, a kind of military figure, not governmental military figure, but trying to reconfigure the country's governmental systems by militant activities. So we have side by side the story of a political conflict and the story of a religious conflict. We also have the story of a transmogrification or transformation or metamorphosis,
kind of transformation,
as an Irish lady becomes a solo female
in the
traveler,
very beginning,
becomes an insider and becomes a goddess of that inside of an alien country.
into the
So it's a story of alienation
who becomes
of
enmeshed
the traveler
a new
converted
belonging.
into new
So the story of
absorbedness or
alienation
belonging
from
of the
a
traveler.
previous culture,
So let us
previous
stop our
community,
lecture here
previous
today
native
now,
land,
and
is
the part
followed
2
by
would continue
the
tomorrow.
initiation ritual of becoming into insider, becoming into a new native